On my right here, I have Jeff Osborne. I'm very privileged to have Jeff here. He's had 30 years of experience in, amongst other things, technical services corps in the military. And I think that teaches you something about bottlenecks and overcoming them. And I think his input, especially in view of his current position at the Retail Motor Industry Organization, will definitely contribute. To his right, we are also very honored to have Mervyn Chetty here from Transnet. And he boasts 23 years of service within Transnet and is currently manager for Africa strategy for the Transnet, for the relevant grouping in the Transnet organization. And I think that experience and his current responsibilities will serve this discussion extremely well. To his right, we also have Kudzi Bangure from Frost & Sullivan, and he, amongst other things, have had a lot of experience in strategy consulting, specifically dealing with market research on African infrastructure. And he's done 22 different or significant market research projects in his current position. So Kudzi, we look forward to having your inputs and sharing your experience in that regard. Transportation in Africa. In this session, we mention road, rail, ports, and air transport. The most obvious subject that we always discuss are the roads in Africa. It's always the potholes and the this and the that. But the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa estimated that for landlocked countries, transport cost can reach up to 77% of the value of the exports. That is absolutely a staggering figure. PIDA also says that savings of 172 billion US dollars can be achieved if the African Regional Transport Integration Network is properly implemented. Now that's a huge figure. That is a larger figure than the GDPs of most African countries. So it is obvious for everyone to see that there are massive improvements that can be attained in terms of poverty alleviation and job creation if we look at that. It's not in the public domain, but since the 70s, we've had a trans-African highway system composed of 9 main corridors, totaling a length of almost 60,000 kilometers. And the design of this dates back to the 1970s. And the example that was also used was that if China was a country that was divided up in 54 different countries with different languages and borders that don't always make sense, would it have attained the same level of development at the rate that they are doing now? I think the answer for that is fairly obvious. So on road transport, I think the question is, why is it that if the benefits are so huge and so obvious that we are not implementing these improvements? What we do now about rail in South Africa and elsewhere in the continent, we want road freight to move to rail. And Africa went through a phase a while ago where a number of concessions were made to entities to run railway lines. Many of these, or most of them, are in some kind of trouble. And the question to the panel and to you is, how can we overcome these bottlenecks? One of the issues that PIDA raised on this is to say that we have to make sure in rail that we are operating our current assets at an acceptable level. We have some experts here from the export councils who can maybe comment on what is it that we need to achieve to, first of all, better utilize our current assets in terms of rail. And then obviously there are demand for lots of rail projects in Africa. PIDA identified, or the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, identified energy as one of the major constraints. And a regional solution or a continental solution to energy has been provided in the PIDA program. It is interesting to note that they have identified on ports 3 or 4 groupings of port improvement projects. And the most important ones are on the Western African seaboard and the other one on the Eastern seaboard. And we know that there are new projects that have to take off. Dar es Salaam port is just not suitable for the future traffic that has to move through it. So alternative ports are considered there, and so on. On the airways, we also know that the Yamoussoukro agreement to free up Africa's airways have been signed a number of years ago. Travel in Africa is extremely expensive, and African governments just seem incapable of agreeing to free up the airways to such an extent that many of us, if we want to go and visit the African Development Bank headquarters in Tunisia, that we don't have to fly all the way to France or to Germany and then all the way back to Tunis, because there are no flight connections between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So these are all issues that create bottlenecks in the transportation sector. And what I would like to do is, first of all, again welcome Tammy Sokutu from African Bank, and just do a quick introduction of Tammy. I'm pleased to have Tammy as the Chief Operating Officer of African Bank Investments Limited here, because one of the issues on transportation is funding. In the case of energy and certain water projects, we know there are off-takers that can fund the road projects. But in the case of roads, we know that in South Africa, tolling can be very and is controversial. And it's also, in the rest of Africa, not straightforward if what funding models should be applied in terms of funding the road projects.
And perhaps just a very brief introduction on who the RMI is, the Retail Motor Industry Organisation. We're the national body that represents the retail sector of the motor industry in South Africa. And we have about 8,000 businesses, motor traders, who are members of ours, across 14 different sectors. So by way of example, we have the service stations, the garages, the car dealers, the panel beaters, the spares outlets, tyre fitment, workshops, to name a few. But more importantly, perhaps, is the fact that our members employ about 300,000 people. So we're a very significant player in terms of job provision and employment. And although we're not, one could argue, subject matter experts where transport is concerned, we are certainly an affected sector, in the sense that where freight comes into the discussion, our members are transporting, they're receiving goods, products, fuel, spares, and so on. And perhaps a different dimension I'd like to introduce into this discussion is the fact that those 300,000 employees commute on a daily basis. I'm essentially saying there's the passenger side of it, there's private vehicles, and of course there's the freight as well. Now, where passenger transport is concerned, and this is a very important one, we have a large workforce out there, and I think it's common knowledge that our public transport system in South Africa leaves quite a bit to be desired. But there also seems to be a lack of an integrated system. And by that I mean where people are commuting by train, where their service exists, and they then need to take a bus or a taxi to reach either their homes or their workplace. There's no integrated, coordinated ticketing system. To some extent, if you like, as we see with the Gautrain, where you can take the bus and there's a card and it covers you for the entire trip. Then private vehicles, and this is an important one. We have roughly about 10 million vehicles on our roads, and the road infrastructure is an important one in the sense that there was a brief comment earlier about the tolling system and road maintenance and so on. And I think we all know that up until 1989, if I'm not mistaken, we actually had a ring-fenced road levy. And in fact, at that time, it was 14 cents a litre. So as a percentage of the price of fuel, it was a very significant contribution towards road maintenance and upgrade. The government, in its wisdom at that time, elected to discontinue ring-fencing the levy. The levy still continued, that 14 cents was still paid by the motorists, but the ring fence disappeared. And I think it's fair to say that since then, of course, we've seen a deterioration in our roads, potholes and so on. And of course, the pre-World Cup, there was this fantastic upgrade of the roads, which was certainly very welcome, and it has made a huge difference in our lives, and we certainly salute SANRAL for the role they played in that. But for what it's worth, the RMI is on the board of OUTA, so we've been involved in the alliance in terms of our sentiments regarding the collection mechanism. We're saying, why not go back to the mechanism that's in place already, the collection mechanism through the price of fuel, without having to spend all this money on the fancy road gantry e-tolling system. Then, of course, where freight is concerned, and there are different modes of transport here. 85% of goods transported happen to be transported by road. I'm very interested to see that that pretty much aligns with the same statistics in the UK. The real reason for it is perhaps because road transport is the most cost-effective and certainly the most efficient means of transportation. But where rail is concerned, and there's no doubt about it, there needs to be a swing towards an upgrade where the rail facility is concerned. There needs to be an integration again between the intermodal transport mechanisms and bottlenecks that exist there where transshipment is concerned. And we know it's very expensive to convert and to move goods from air to rail and from rail to road and backwards and forwards. And then just closing comments from RMI side is that the realities are that the infrastructure to accommodate road transport is easiest and develop and cheapest to develop and to expand and maintain. Rail infrastructure is cumbersome to develop, and after geographical spread, it becomes difficult to fix afterwards and very, very costly. But obviously, it needs to be utilized to the maximum where that is possible. And then there needs to be efficient intermodal facilities that must be created. They need to be fast, cheap, safe, and clean. And bottlenecks that result in inappropriate modes being used. Passengers are best suited to trains, there's no doubt about it. But it's not that profitable in terms of the return they can expect from passenger fares. So there are certainly some challenges, and as an industry, we are directly affected by it. We do feel it. It impacts on the cost of doing business, both from an export and an import perspective within our industry.
You know, there's about 9 countries in Africa that are experiencing growth greater than 7%. It's about 12 countries with a growth rate of about 5 to 7%. So about 18 countries with a moderate growth between 3 to 5%. And I think these are statistics within the African continent which you perhaps might not find in other countries like in the US and in Europe, given some of the economic crisis that's being experienced right now. I think more importantly, we have about a 1.7 trillion economy on this continent. It's higher than India, and this growth is perhaps much more likely to be sustained than some of the developed economies. I think if you look at South Africa as well, just in the SADC region, we have a market to the tune of about 1 billion people. So I think it's quite a significant amount of market. The 1% penetration into that market in whatever goods or services or commodities that you're playing in, provides quite a big step in market penetration. The World Bank estimated that Africa requires $93 billion for the next 10 years every year, and that's for power, water, supply, sanitation, transport, ICT, and irrigation. And I think just on transport alone, it's about 18.2 billion a year that we require. I think just bringing it back sort of closer to what the chairman was saying and giving an account of the transport infrastructure on the continent. There's 51 railways in 36 countries on this continent. 13 countries have no railway systems. There's an operational network of 55,000 kilometers. Let me add to that, it's operational network. In other words, lines that are working, supposedly working, okay? That's 55,000 kilometers. So we have about 33% of Africa's rail network here in South Africa. That's on the rail side. I think we have an infrastructure backlog about $3 billion on the continent per year. I think that's a number that's been quoted and reflected in some of the studies that have been done by IFC and the World Bank. On the port side, in Africa, there's about 80 ports, 80. It's quite a significant amount that handles both containerized cargo and general cargo. About 20 countries have a national throughput of about 100,000 TEUs, and TEUs is 20-foot equivalent units. To put that into perspective, in South Africa, we handled 4.3 million 20-foot equivalent units for the last financial year. And that's quite a significant amount. The first one is Egypt, where they handle slightly more than us. So for container traffic, we are number 2 in the region. We handle about 800 and some odd, about 826,000 TEUs transshipment traffic. That transshipment traffic is predominantly traffic coming from the Far East, getting discharged into South Africa, and then we feeder that into East and West Africa. And we'll talk about that perhaps later on the plan of how we think that we can reduce the total logistics cost for the African countries and the benefit to us as consumers within the region. I think on the PEDA program highlights quite a significant amount of projects, but there's about 54, 57 projects that are highlighted that cuts across port, rail, and pipelines. And a lot of those projects are related to transport infrastructure. And I think there's quite a concerted effort from all parties around rallying around to get moving on that. I think what is important for us as a country is the opportune position that we have as South Africa, and how we can help the region, especially when it comes to a transshipment hub like the Port of Muga in the Eastern Cape. I think those are some of the areas on the port side. I think what is also important is on the pipeline side. We've seen quite a bit of investments being looked at. There's about $21 billion going into about a 20,000 kilometer pipeline, between 2010 and 2014. I think that has started. There's also a Trans-Sahara gas pipeline from Nigeria to Algeria. That's about $10 billion. I think essentially, in a nutshell, just looking at the transport system alone, there's a series of challenges. The first big one is a lack of investments in ports, rail, and pipelines. And I think the question that was posed earlier on by the chairman is, we perhaps need to get the utilization up in the railway systems in Africa. The problem is that you cannot get the utilization of these things up if you don't start to invest in maintenance and so on. And some of the railway systems have old ways of, they don't have concrete sleepers in there. They have wooden sleepers, and those things have to be overhauled. Some of them have a very lightweight. You can only, like in Tanzania's case, it's 13 ton per load axle limit. It's not a heavy oil line. In South Africa, we're in the 60 tons. So, it's quite challenging. So it's not only trying to aspire to increase the utilization of these lines, but I think the first thing is investments, the lack of investments. That's the one challenge. I think the second challenge is we don't really have the technical skills and knowledge on the continent. And I'll give you a very good example. 85% of maritime people in Africa, whether you're a pilot, in other words, bringing in a ship, or a tug master, or a cadet, you get trained in Europe. So all of those people in Africa get sent to Antwerp, Rotterdam, and so on, and get trained there. And then 9 out of 10 times, when they come back into Africa, after 2 years working in the continent, they get offered to work in Europe because they get paid in euros and so on. And then the skills go out. Okay, but yet in South Africa, we have the School of Ports, we have the School of Port Operations, we have the best simulators, better than some of the European countries. We can simulate any port, any terminal in the world, and we can train those people, and they're accredited by ILO. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in celebrating some of the successes within the country. The third challenge I think we've identified is regional integration. If you look at regional integration, we as Africa only trade with each other 12%. In other words, we would buy fresh cut flowers from Kenya, or we would buy bananas from Ghana, etc. So we would only buy from African countries to the tune of 12%. Now, in the United States, they trade with each other 87%. And in Far Eastern China, they're looking at 91%. Okay, so we have a big jump to move towards regional integration, and we perhaps need to do a lot more industrialization, manufacturing, and so on within the continent, upgrade and invest a lot more in infrastructure. And I think the fourth one, the last one, is really governments in Africa don't really have the funds to invest in it. And this is where both government and private sector needs to come to the party, and DFI is included. We as Transnet have formulated a South Africa Inc. approach, where if we go into any one of these countries, we have the technical expertise, we have the manufacturing capabilities to manufacture and supply locomotives, wagons, and coaches, and port equipment. We can do maintenance and so on. So when we're going into these countries, we're going in with DBSA, with IDC, and other DFIs. So we're going in to say, here's a party that can offer the financial solutions. Here's the party as Transnet can offer the technical solutions, and here's people that can offer training solutions, etc. So that when you go into this country or these countries, you actually offer an integrated solution. So you're going into these countries as South Africa Inc. So it's really a South Africa team approach. And I think the Chinese have done this very well. I mean, if you look at some of the guys going into Africa, the strategy is led right from the top. Okay, and they have a clear-cut Africa strategy. So when they go in, there are people that are construction companies, there are people that are financing it, there are people that are technical experts, and there are people that are operating it.
So the research program that I head up is the Africa Infrastructure Research Program. And what we basically do is we track African infrastructure within West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. And our key focus within tracking African infrastructure is looking at the broader market dynamics that are affecting infrastructure growth. So we look at what are the key challenges affecting infrastructure growth, specifically ports, rail, and we look at what are some of the key drivers and what are some of the key restraints. And then within the context of that, we also look at what are the different funding mechanisms that are utilized in Africa, who are the different funding parties that are involved in African infrastructure. So just to start off with at a broad level, I think Mervyn has already touched on some of the key challenges that are faced in Africa, but one of the key challenges is obviously the lack of skills. And the trouble with that is you have ripple effects that move on into delays of projects, cancellation of projects, and then once you have that sort of ripple effect, that leads into escalating costs for all the different projects, and then that then speaks to the different bottlenecks that we'd like to discuss. So if there can be a mechanism that can be found to address that lack of skilled labor, perhaps partnering with European countries or other regions that have more advanced skills, and then bring those into Africa so that we can overcome that critical challenge. Another key challenge that we managed to identify is poor allocation of financial resources across various regions in Africa. This speaks primarily to bureaucracy within organizations. It speaks to corruption within organizations. So you have a lot of organizations across Africa that sit with pools of funds for investment, but because those funds are not appropriated accordingly, be it because of bureaucracy or because of corruption, that also leads to all those different bottlenecks. So that's another key challenge that we identified, that if that can be overcome in terms of ensuring that the different funds that are available, those are disseminated to the relevant areas, be it rail, roads, or ports, that would ultimately ensure that all those bottlenecks are reduced in various regions of Africa. Another key challenge that we managed to identify is the low ease of doing business. And this is primarily for all those different sectors that are either have been war-torn, where you've got a lot of civil war, or some regions of the country, of the continent where you've got tough economic conditions, for example, in Zimbabwe, where there's political instability as well. All of this contributes to all those bottlenecks that you have in infrastructure development, and at the ease of doing business within various regions in West Africa, in Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, in the DRC. If those different challenges can be addressed, then we definitely would see a reduction in the bottlenecks that you have on a continent-wide scale. The heavy reliance on donor funding is also another key challenge, and Mervyn has really touched a bit on that as well, that a lot of the African governments heavily rely on donor funding. And the key challenge with that is your African government does not have they do not drive where infrastructure development is supposed to go, because they're not in charge of the different funding. So as much as they might set the agenda, they don't have full control in terms of how infrastructure development is supposed to be rolled out, be it over a 5 or a 10-year period. The decision will also ultimately lead with where the funding is coming from. So that over-reliance on donor funding is another critical challenge that is ultimately resulting in the different bottlenecks. And in terms of addressing that, perhaps this speaks to one of the key drivers that we identified. Increased involvement in the private sector in terms of funding is something that could definitely start alleviating that. And where we could see that happening are the different sectors where you've got high growth in the minerals and resources sectors, and in the oil and gas sectors. So if you look at all the developments that are happening, be it in Kenya, in Namibia with uranium, DRC, copper, if you look at Mozambique with coal, all those different developments within the private sector, if those can sort of be channeled in to assist the funding mechanisms that need to be used to ultimately reduce bottlenecks in Africa, that will ultimately assist and ensure that high growth is maintained in Africa over a long period of time. I think one of the other key challenges that we managed to identify is the lack of some key resources such as power distribution across Africa, water distribution as well. The key challenge with that is once you don't have those key resources that are required for projects to be on the go and to ultimately run smoothly, you end up with the bottlenecks. You end up with all these projects that stop at a critical phase, or projects that are cancelled or that are delayed. And then that also then speaks to the escalating costs, and the bottleneck then ultimately increases. So other areas where we would ultimately want to see addressed is the increased power distribution across Africa. And then that would sort of feed into assisting all the different infrastructure bottlenecks that we have across Africa. So in terms of key challenges, I think those are some of the key challenges that we've managed to identify. And these are not specific to a particular region. There's span over the whole of Africa, so West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. The intensity and the complexity of each of these challenges will obviously vary with the country-specific dynamics, but those are sort of the general challenge that we have noticed across Africa as a whole. And then in terms of some of the key drivers which we've managed to identify, and we feel some of these will assist in alleviating some of these challenges. Regional integration, which has already been mentioned by Mervyn. We feel that if there's increased regional integration from the power side, for example, integrated power pools, that will ultimately feed into the infrastructure development that is required to sustain all these different mechanisms. Integration of telecoms, for example, that also will require a lot of infrastructure on the ground to assist and support that going forward. Another key driver that we think speaks to reducing all these bottlenecks is increased interregional trade. If we look at the interregional trade, some of the figures that we've analyzed in 2010, only 7% of the interregional of the trade within specific regions of Africa, so be it West Africa, Central Africa, or East Africa, or North Africa, only 7% could be attributed to interregional trade. So that there needs to be increased. And if you look at other regions across the globe, the interregional trade is a lot higher. If interregional trade can be increased, that will also assist in reducing the bottlenecks that you have across Africa on the entire continent. I think the final key driver that we managed to identify is the rapid urbanization. And this is primarily within your mineral-rich regions of the African continent. So you're looking at areas such as Namibia, DRC, Zambia, areas where new reserves have been found in Mozambique or in Kenya. If we can hone in all the progress and all the development that will come in from rapid urbanization and those growing populations, we can mobilize all the funding that comes out of various programs that are aimed at that. That could also ultimately assist in reducing all the different bottlenecks that you have across Africa.
I think that is quite appropriate to be talking about transport infrastructure in Africa, particularly at this time when there's so much optimism from the rest of the world about Africa. I know that for many, many years we've always been saying that it's Africa's time. The giant will awake. But clearly, we've seen a lot more inflows of foreign direct investments to the continent in the recent years, and there's predictions for more to come. And therefore, the topic about infrastructure driving economic change in Africa is a very appropriate one indeed. But it's a topic that's been on the agenda of the World Economic Forum for Africa, certainly for the past 5 years when I've been attending it. It's a topic that is high on the agenda of NEPAD. It's a topic that is high on the World Bank. So if it's been high on these agendas, why is it that it seems that the movement is slower than it should be? I'd like to offer that one of the key issues that is lacking is clarity of vision with regards to what we want to do with the various economic zones in Africa, particularly in the context of regional integration. The theme of regional integration has come through here, which is clearly, we cannot talk about Africa as though we can tackle it as one country. So the way to start dealing with it is obviously through regional integration. But in that context, it is important to have clarity of vision for the regions for the economic regions that are concerned, in identifying what is it that they're going to be trading within each other and outside of the region. I was involved many years ago in the upgrading of the road that connects South Africa and Mozambique. It was important before that road was upgraded for us to have clarity in South Africa, to have clarity in Mozambique, what are the benefits that are going to be accruing as a result of the spend in the upgrading of that road. And a lot of time was spent talking about that, discussing about that. And secondly, once you've got that, in my view, it's important to identify what is your competitive driver from a transportation point of view. Is it through air? Is it through ports? Is it through the roads? One of the issues that we've been tackling with in South Africa for a long time was whether we want to rely mainly on road transportation through these huge trucks, which are putting pressure on the road, or want to use ports, or want to use other forms. And I think these things should not just hobble on. They have to be part of a clear strategy, what we want to do as a country from a competitive point of view. The third issue that has been raised, again here, is the issue of funding. Now, the issue of funding is not only about the funding of the infrastructure concerned, it actually should be seen in the context of how a country allocates its own resources, but also how it collects funding from the people who are supposed to be paying. World Bank has estimated recently that about 65% of people in the continent are not paying for their bills, whether it's water or electricity. Now, clearly, if that is the case, it means that there is pressure on the resources that government has to allocate on other things. Next to that is the whole issue of competition of resources. For as long as the twin peaks of poverty and unemployment are the main focus, as they should be, prioritization of other investments is going to suffer. In the continent, it is estimated that about at least a third of the people are not living near roads in the rural areas. They're living away from the roads. Now, if you take that situation, it means that governments faced with allocation of resources are going to be preoccupied with allocation of resources to deal with the day-to-day issues of the people in their countries. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the there's a kind of a dangerous vicious cycle between upgrading infrastructure in general, so that we can have economic flow into the country, so that we can deal with the issues of poverty. But at the same time, governments, because they are governments, they are politically elected, they want to prioritize, as they should, allocation of resources to the day-to-day issues. The issue of governance in these cross-border projects is a big issue. Again, I want to go back to the project which I was involved in between South Africa and Mozambique, where we spent a lot of time discussing roles in the particular project and who should be doing what, etc., etc. And I remember towards the end of the project, when we were reflecting, when we were meeting in Mozambique with the relevant ministers at the time, one of the issues that the minister raised was the fact that we spend a lot of time fighting upfront about who should be doing what. And that talks to governance and therefore allocation of resources to the various roles. Governance is a big issue in the continent, not only at government level, but I'm talking specifically in these cross-border issues or cross-border initiatives around these projects. The other issue that comes across, particularly in countries that are either landlocked or they are transit countries, is the issue of incentives for those countries to participate in infrastructure projects, road infrastructure projects that are going through those countries. What are the incentives that they are getting or they're going to get? And this also talks to the presence or lack thereof of political will in the countries that are affected. Again, this has to be looked in the context of regional integration. We are still approaching the issue of tendering for projects. I'm talking, when I say we, I'm talking specifically of South Africa. Tendering for projects in the continent in a fragmented approach. Whereas, where the innovative approach comes in from the Chinese is that there are country packages that they actually go to countries with, so that they actually presenting the whole package. So when they go to a government, they don't want funding from anybody, they don't want skills, they've got everything. And that is why they're actually winning so many projects in the continent. So the funding issue, we need to find some very, very innovative ways of funding these projects. Albert Einstein describes insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for different outcomes. And I think for as long as we do the same thing, which we're currently doing now, we are not going to crack the issue of funding because resources are always going to be an issue, financial resources. It was said earlier that the World Bank has estimated about 93 billion rand, and that figure fluctuates depending which document you read. But one of the issues or the initiative that the World Bank has done, it has produced what is called Africa in-country diagnostics. It's a very comprehensive document that gives diagnostics of what are the issues in the various countries in Africa when it comes to transportation infrastructure upgrade. The other issue that has come through is the issue of inadequate coordination of these projects. And as a result, prioritization of the projects becomes a problem. If you read NEPAD documents, they will tell you that one of the issues that we've got a long list of infrastructure projects in the continent. Some of them should not be on that list. They should be shoved and focus on those that are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. And we keep on talking about this thing in the continent, we keep on talking about it across the African countries, but it's actually not happening on the ground. We have to look at the almost billion people in the country as one market with different economic hubs. Because if you look at that, then it enables us to think differently from the way we think in an isolated approach about our infrastructure at the moment. We have to start thinking about the billion people as a market, and therefore our economic strategies, including road transportation, should link to what do these consumers want to consume, and how do we then take those to them. Thanks very much.
The president of the African Development Bank said yesterday at the African Union Summit that lack of political will is slowing down the implementation of vital regional infrastructure projects. And he mentioned a couple of examples like the Kazangula Bridge and also the bridge in the Gambia, who will connect the countries as examples where political will is slowing it down. The IFDB also announced that they have signed an agreement with the World Customs Organization, understanding that that is a key area of moving goods across borders that needs to be improved. And basically, a lot of leadership has come from the continental bodies. For the first time in Africa's history, we do have a continental plan through the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. And it wasn't plain sailing, because when the NEPAD initiative was started in 2002, at the continental level, there were disagreements of where it should be located, what their responsibilities are. And it's only recently, and for the first time, both the African Union African Development Bank, and the NEPAD Planning and Coordination Agency issued or started the process which led to the creation of PIDA, who wants to have an effective impact on integration of the continent. There's a need for physical integration of networks, convergence of policies, joint planning, and development of transport facilities and systems, harmonization of standards, joint cross-border investments. This is what PIDA seeks. And I think it's incumbent on this, and I'd like to open to the floor now for questions and suggestions. And I think it's clear from the comments that we got from our panel that there's a lot of knowledge here in terms of research and a lot of understanding for the